Great. That's good. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Rich TV. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with an American entrepreneur, the founder of a $7.5 billion fund now, and funds under management, Skybridge, the SALT conference, the one and only Anthony Scaramucci. Anthony, thanks a lot for making the time today.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Ali.
Anthony, look, can I start, because obviously you served you at the White House very briefly. You've seen the Trump administration up close and personal. How do you look at the situation today? What's your perspective on what's happening? And then how are you projecting into November when we have the election?
Well, I mean, I think what's happening is a U.S. tragedy, and because the U.S. is so connected into the world, it's a global tragedy. And so you have a combination of general incompetence, and you have a combination of fear. The president, who acts very abnormal, has struck fear in the hearts of his party. And so you can't really get people around him right now that are going to tell him the truth or are going to try to do the right thing. I want to start with a conversation I had with a cabinet official in 2019, October. So this person came to my office. They'll remain nameless for the purposes of protecting them because they're a little bit more private than I am. But they're no longer with the administration, former cabinet officials sitting on my couch in my office. He said, listen, this is going to be very bad. Thank God thus far, there has not been a crisis. But if there is a crisis, the executive branch of the United States will not be able to handle this. Well, why wouldn't it be? Well, the president's not good at managing. He has other skills. I want to be objective about President Trump. He's a communicator. He certainly knows how to gravitate people to him. He can put on a rally, but he's not a good manager. And whether you read the Harvard Business School textbooks or your learnings from the Pentagon, you know that you can only have 6 or so reports. But the problem is with the president, he has no reports. And so every morning it's like a billiard game. The cue ball hits the billiards. They spray all over the billiard table, and nobody knows what they're doing, and there's no symphony and there's no coordination among the branches of government. You have 19 cabinet level positions, 190 sub-agencies, and there's no model for creating that activity. And so people are blinded with fear, because if they do something that crosses the president, they'll end up like you or me. They'll be tweeted out of office. They'll be humiliated in the press. And then Trump will try to grind them into broken glass due to his personal insecurities. And so if there's a crisis, they're not going to be ready to handle it. They will not be able to be prepared for it. And, it seems like 100 years ago now, but I thought the crisis was going to be the General Soleimani event, the strike on the general in early January, which seems like 200 years ago today. I thought, okay, this is the crisis. Now, thank God, cooler heads prevailed and the tensions got reduced again. But the crisis actually turned out to be COVID-19. And the president and his team were not equipped to handle it. President Trump is the modern LBJ. His skill set, some of those skills are quite good. Let's just be objective about him. I don't want to demonize him. I think when you demonize human beings, you're running the risk of losing some of their acolytes. Because what happens is the flaps go over their ears and they don't listen to you anymore because they feel like, okay, you just hate the guy, so you're demonizing him. What we need to do to defeat him is you have to work on hearts and minds, and you have to speak to them rationally. So he has a lot of good skill sets, but the skill set to handle the world today, its current events, what's going on geopolitically, it doesn't marry his skill set. And this is why he's in the quagmire that he's in. And as you know, which is evident from the way he handles himself, there's a tremendous amount of self-loathing and victimization in the man's personality, which is further driving this negative feedback loop of all this negative activity. So here we are, the crisis came, the executive branch of the United States was not capable of handling that. And it's primarily due to the president's management style.
So do you see, for example, you're talking about, I mean, it's not even one crisis, is it? There's multiple crises in a way. But if you look at COVID in particular, you know, I know he's going back today. They're saying he's going to hold his first press conference after a long absence. How do you read that? What was that, a failure on his part, a failure to intellectually engage with the virus and think it through, or what? Because, you know, he said earlier on it's going to go away like a miracle. By that stage, he should have already known it was a problem. I saw reports that he was being told in November that this problem is coming. Navarro apparently was warning him in January. How do you explain the failure in that area?
Well, again, it has to do with his personality. So, and I want to be fair to him. I don't think a President Obama, a President Gandhi, a President Jesus, a President Mohammed in the American culture getting the intelligence briefs would have moved as quickly as the South Korean government, because it's a different culture. And the North American governments did not experience SARS and MERS to the extent that the Asian governments did. And so on January 21st, coincidentally, the first COVID case was in the US and the first COVID case was in South Korea. The South Koreans moved to lock it down. Everybody wore masks. There was a level of social distancing, and they more or less bankrupted the virus. But in the United States, a very different culture. They weren't used to it. And so there's no chance any president would have never shut down the economy on the same day as the South Koreans. However, as the information was unfolding and the intelligence briefings were unfolding and the epidemiological studies were being presented to the president, his failure to act, I think, will go down as one of the presidential malpractices of the modern era. And so, you know, whether it's the New York Times or the Columbia University is citing 60 to 70,000 deaths can be attributed to that lack of action. And so, and that's because of the president's personality and his skill set. His skill set is to tell you that a 100 square meter apartment is 200 square meters. His skill set is to tell you that, you know, what you see before you isn't true, but what I'm saying is true. And so one thing about scientific fact, you can't yell fake science. You can't look at the cameras and point to them and say fake science. And let me tell you, 2 plus 2 is not 4, but 2 plus 2 is actually 7. And because people can look at their hands and say, wait a minute, it's really 4. What is he saying? And so if you go back to February and early March, every time he got to the podium and said this sort of nonsense, the markets quaked, people got very scared, there was a level of disarray in the economy. And so again, it's just not his skill set. Somebody that was well-versed in technocratic leadership, or somebody had more self-confidence in the president. Remember, he lacks self-confidence and he lacks security. He's a very insecure man. Hard to believe, because he made it to the presidency and he's had an astounding life. You'd have to ask yourself, where's the void in the man's personality? But the insecurity prevents him from listening to experts or listening to smart people about different things that they may know more about than him. In fact, if anything, he rejects them, and he sort of has this anti-intellectual, anti-expert, anti-elitist strategy. And he'll literally look at generals and say that he's smarter than them, and he has a very big brain, and he's a very stable genius, and his uncle went to MIT, and so therefore he's gifted and knows more about the disease than the epidemiologist. And so all of this nonsense, okay, that people listen to, and then you have news organizations like Fox News that are shooting a prism, connecting the verbiage of the president into a prism and trying to shoot it out on a wall and trying to make sense of it. And then you have something else going on in our country, which I think you know, but it's worth restating. We have a great culture war going on in our country right now. We have conservatives that believe the country should operate a certain way, and we have liberals and progressives that think it should operate in a different way. And the great irony about their narratives is that this country is such a wonderful political experiment that they both can have their great lives. They can both express their identities and their individuality without encroaching on each other. But what politicians have done in our country is we've pitted those cultures against each other. And so, the president's a great tribal leader. And so he turned the disease into a political statement. So if you're wearing a mask, you are subverting your freedom to the progressive left. And so therefore, do not wear the mask. But however, Dr. Anthony Fauci and others would tell you, pandemic experts would tell you scientifically, wearing a mask is probably the best way to combat the disease and to prevent the disease spread. But the president turned that into something political. And so now his Republican red-leaning states, governors, they went with the president. They're trying to please him. They're all going to discover shortly that he is a black hole of displeasure. There's no pleasing President Trump. And so he keeps moving the goalposts on everybody. You're trying to please him, and he's moving the goalposts. He's never pleased. And so you have governors in Georgia and Florida that made decisions that were not based on the epidemiology, that were not based on the science, that were not based on the recommendations, but they were done to please President Trump. And they were done to make these political statements that we're the land of the free and you should not wear a mask and you should cavort wherever you want. And the result of which you have these raging hotspots now around the country. And so when you look at these charts, it was up in the mid-March. It got stabilized, but we opened too quickly and we didn't listen to the science and the data. And now it's raging in certain parts of the country, which has immobilized the country. But the president did solve the immigration problem. Let me explain to you how he did that, Ali. He solved the immigration problem because nobody wants to come in and nobody can get out because of him. Okay, so I can't fly to Europe this summer for a holiday. I can't fly to certain areas of the world like the Bahamas. And so, this is due to rank incompetence. Now, the great irony of everything that I'm saying is that it sounds partisan. If I was on an American television expressing this view, there'd be a very large group of people that are saying, no, he's not objective. He hates Donald Trump. And so therefore, he's a partisan hack. In the meantime, I'm a lifelong Republican. I've supported the Republican Party my entire life, with the exception of Barack Obama and I went to law school together. And so I helped him out. We were young men in our mid-40s at the time. God bless him. He went on to become the president. People probably miss him now because he was a fairly moderate guy. Did he do everything right? No. What human being does everything right? But we have a disaster on our hands now, and it's going to have incalculable consequence to a lot of people because the economy could already be rebounding. It's not. The death tolls are rising. They could have been contained. And you're going into the election season, and this guy's a ruthless guy. He's going to start to do things that threaten the American system and the American democracy. And so that's the great irony. It took 240 years to get a beast like this, but we got one. And so now what we have to do is we have to drop our partisanship. We have to rise to our patriotism, and we have to defeat him so that we can restage the system, re-engineer the Republican Party, and hopefully open that party up demographically so it doesn't just become this minority party for a generation.
Anthony, can I now take you on to another big issue of our time, which really is the US-China, this very aggressive China post-COVID reaction. I mean, they're parked on the Indian border. They've now pretty much rolled over Hong Kong, as far as I can tell. Pretty aggressive language coming out of their diplomats. How do you read the US, China, and China position overall? I mean, you've got some folks who are in the administration who see it as a Darwinian battle. There's only going to be one winner or loser, and we've got to engage. We've got others who, particularly in the business community, still talking about engagement. How do you read the scenario as we find it now?
So it's very complex. because, I see it from both sides. Even though I'm an American, I see it from both sides. The Chinese since 1979 have been trying to figure out a way to use a one-party system married to some level of capitalism to lift 500 million to 1 billion people out of poverty. The rest of the world, frankly, thought that that was in the best interest of the rest of the world, and I still think that it is. The post-World War II strategy for America and the West was to create rising living standards. If you go back to Dean Atkinson, the Secretary of State, or Harry Truman, the United States was willing to accept an uneven playing field in trade. Why? We were the richest economy, we were the strongest industrial power, we had 2/3 of the global economic output with about 4 or 5% of the globe's population in 1947 and 48. And so we knew we had to let the other countries grow and create rising living standards. The Marshall Plan, the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs to even out the system. And so we accepted this because we knew it would lead to greater peace and greater global prosperity. And so when China got back on the grid after the death of Mao and Deng Xiaoping wanted to create these reforms, the United States was by and large receptive to this because they wanted China to catch up with the rest of the industrialized world, because they knew if China became integrated and there was a strong bilateral relationship between the US and China, or China and the West, it would go a long way to reducing violence and hopefully lead to more peace. And so a lot of things were done intentionally by the West. The introduction of the World Trade Organization by China, President Clinton supported that, and other Western leaders. And so China began its rise. There are critics of China that would say, well, they did some intellectual property theft, they sort of subverted the trade rules, they've made sore the EU and America. And this is where I actually think President Trump is right. Establishment politicians in the West committed a malpractice. They could have held China to the obligations of certain trade agreements, to the obligations of certain patent and intellectual property law. And for whatever reason, there was a great deal of laxity. Okay, so this got a reinforcement of the Chinese. And so now when the president came in and said, well, there's an unevenness and China has already advanced now, we need to right-size the playing field. The great irony of that is that the Obama administration was doing that with TPP. The Obama administration said, okay, look, we're going to reject some of the things that you're doing, but moreover, we're going to empower these other 11 nations to trade with us, and this where it'll hold you in check. So there was a combination of things that were going on. But the president, because we have a systemic rise of populism right now, this is born from our income inequality in the US, he lambasted those trade deals. And he said that they were unfair and they were elitist and they were to promote rich Americans versus poor Americans. And so even Secretary Clinton disavowed that trade deal. Okay, so I have to apply all that context to tell you now what I think, because now we're at this situation where we had a rise in polemics, we had a rise in aggressive rhetoric towards each other, and we've had a new trade deal. And that trade deal is slightly better for the United States. And if you really look through it, it's really not that much different. The president is declaring a victory, and the Chinese are actually very sore at the way things went down because it was a loss of face in their culture, okay? And they were browbeaten to an extent. And so we're sitting here now with this tension. Is some of that tension necessary to make the playing field more even? Perhaps it is, but we could have gone about it in a totally different way. He had advisors. I was there. I was on his executive transition team. He had advisors telling him 2% a quarter. In 10 quarters, you'll have a 20% tariff. You'll give the entire supply chain an ability to adjust to these tariffs. And you'll start a negotiation with the Chinese. And if we can get them to come to a tariff parity solution, and we can get them to reduce certain things that they're doing as it relates to trade that are unfair, we'll call that a win. He didn't want to do it that way. He was too narcissistic. He created this whole Trump tariff roulette scheme, all this bellicosity of rhetoric. And all this stuff is frankly very dangerous. So now we're sitting here now, we're pitted against each other. And I predict that you'll have a change of leadership. Vice President Biden will likely win this election. And when he does, I predict there will be a revisiting of the TPP, and there will be a revisiting of a reduction in the bellicosity of rhetoric. And, whatever you think of President Xi, I don't think he wants war. I certainly think he wants regional sovereignty, if you will. I think that's why he's building these islands in the South China Sea, and this is why he's projecting some naval power, and this is also why they're spending money on the One Belt, One Road initiative. But I'm going to make the bet that they don't want war. I'm going to make the bet that it's nonsensical for them to want to have war. If you really understand their culture, they think in 100, 200-year units of time, and there's no need for them to have a war. What is important for them, however, is to create more stability inside their country, because you and I know this, most Americans don't know this, those are 7 Balkanized provinces that are tightly woven by one communist party. And there's a lot of dissent in China. And there's a lot of VPN use. And there's a lot of people inside of China that would like more freedom. They would like more freedom of press, freedom of dissent, freedom of criticism, a more open system. And again, I'm not here to opine on which system is better, okay? That's not my job as an American citizen to be involved in the domestic policies or politics internal to China. But here's what I would say to you. And if you were a Chinese official, what I would say is open up a little. Don't be afraid of it. Your success measured by your GDP per capita, your success measured by 41 years of growth, I think will rue the day. And I think that politicians that are willing to accept some level of dissent and criticism, you actually have a more stable, interwoven society. So that would be me. I'm probably being too long-winded on this answer. I apologize for that. But in quick summary, this is going to improve after Trump is out of office. There are some people that say that the Chinese want Trump to stay in office because he's destroying the Western alliance. He's hurting. I don't believe that. I don't think that they want him to stay in office because he's too much of a wild card, and he's too unsettling to the world and their long-term global growth prospects.
Anthony, you've got $7.5 billion under management. You've come from a background of running hedge funds and so forth. How do you see the markets right now? Because we've had pretty extreme responses, pretty extreme, rampant money supply growth. We've had the stock market. I mean, the Nasdaq yesterday, I think, closed at a record.
Yeah.
How do you navigate these waters?
Well, I mean, listen, what I would say to you is that the Nasdaq is a representation of a tremendous amount of liquidity that's been flowing in by the central banking community, $13 trillion last time I checked since March. And this flow of liquidity is going into large capitalized stocks, which are perceived to be safe. Those companies like Microsoft and those tech companies like Amazon and Tesla, they're doing well in the crisis. There's large moats around their businesses. They're large companies. Remote access is benefiting them and all that other stuff. And so they're trading up. But, my friend Jim Cramer, I worked with Goldman Sachs with, who's now a pundit on CNBC, is a legendary hedge fund manager. He would tell you it's very dangerous. This is very reminiscent to the late 1999 cycle, which led to a tech bubble in the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq got to a peak of about 5,000 on March 9th, 2000, and it was actually March 3rd, 2000. March 9th, 2000, it was another debacle after the global financial crisis. But March 3rd, 2000, the Nasdaq was at 5,100, and in short order, it got cut by 60%. And so if people don't think they could lose value in stocks that are trading at 150, 170 times earnings, trust me, they can. And history suggests that. So I'm recommending to people that they diversify away from those stocks. But if you're asking me, will the markets go up? The markets are going up. There's just too much liquidity. You can't fight the Federal Reserve. You can't fight the Bank of China, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank. You can't fight these guys. It's going to push all of these assets up. Will the economy catch up? That's the question. And I think it will, but it'll take longer because of the mismanagement of the federal government here in the United States. There was an opportunity to fix this, but we couldn't fix it. And so now we're going to be lagging. I still think you got 12 to 18 months before you see a full blooming economic recovery now because of the mismanagement.
Anthony, I know you've got a meeting to go to, and I'm really grateful for you finding the time for
No, it's my pleasure. Continue the great writing. Continue the great writing. I look forward to reading your stuff.
And I really appreciate the support, and you take care.
Okay. God bless. Good luck to you.